we had a group of BSc alumni presenting their CARCEIT, presenting on the CARCEIT funded project. And this week we have our second alumna working together with Dr. Michelle Bedecker, and Assel also has other team members. He might introduce them, yeah. But on a very interesting topic, Assel is currently a teaching fellow in Nazarbayev University's Center for Preparatory Studies. And again, it's a critical reflection on the teaching and learning resources that are being used. And she will be looking at students' transition and navigation of language, identity, and culture in academic texts. Assel presented earlier on at the beginning of, I think, maybe last summer or at the beginning of this term. And those who were there, we kind of know what the broader topic is about. But today she is sharing with us findings and data from her project. Thank you very much, Assel, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the seminar. I hope you'll find it interesting and you'll share some of your thoughts, comments, and ask questions at the end. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I will try to keep the presentation brief so that we have more time for the discussion. So my name is Assel Sadykova. I'm a teaching fellow at the Center for Preparatory Studies. And today I'm going to present a research project supported by CARCEIT, which is titled Students' Transition and Navigation of Language, Identity, and Culture in Academic Texts. Okay. Start right now. Yeah. Okay. Right, so first of all, I wanted to introduce you my wonderful team. We have Jansia, who is here with us. She's our research assistant who has done a lot of work on data collection and analysis, and this project wouldn't have been possible without her. And we have Professor Michelle Bedecker, who is an advisor of this project, and she was guiding us a lot, supporting with your expertise, with your experience and knowledge. And currently, she is an associate professor at New Uzbekistan University, but earlier she worked here at GSC. So this is the outline of the presentation. I'm going to talk about background, research purpose and research questions, theoretical framework of the study, research methodology, data analysis process. I will present some findings and discuss some implications that these findings have for teaching and Q&A. So speaking of the background for this study, it's interesting that when you look at studies in EMI field, then you can see that there is a lot of focus on the language. So a lot of studies explore what language challenges students experience, or, for example, what language proficiency level students need in order to navigate EMI studies successfully. And actually, my master's research was also focused on language-related challenges of students, especially when they're transitioning from school to university, like this one, where English is used as medium of instruction. But then, when I was listening to research participants and when I was reading the interview transcripts, I could hear between the words that it was more than language. They talked about the need to think in a different way when they start studying fully in English. They talked about communicating in a different way and different approach they need to take when they read texts or when they write their essays. So, and then I was lucky to have Professor Michelle as my professor, and we talked about this topic, and she also suggested for us to look kind of deeper into this question and explore this further by looking at what are the factors contribute to challenges students experience. And here, first of all, we can talk about context of culture. So Pauline Gibbons actually suggests this concept of in-the-head knowledge that we need in order to read text and to understand them fully. And in-the-head knowledge, it is this knowledge which we acquire culturally when we are members of certain culture, when we read different texts on various topics. So we rely on all kinds of knowledge to understand even a simple text. And this concept of in-the-head knowledge relies on the idea of schema, like schema theory, that we all have this schematic knowledge that helps us become successful readers. So here, for example, she says, meaning does not reside solely in the words and structures of the text, but it is constructed in the interactions between the text and in the head or schematic knowledge of the reader. So it's more than language. So sometimes we might experience challenges, not only because we don't know the language, but because maybe that in the head knowledge is different for the readers, and maybe of the text they're reading, the in the head knowledge can be different. So there is this mismatch, and that's what can cause these challenges. Then literacy practices. So especially when students transition, for example, from school to university, there are differences between school-based and university-based literacy practices. But students still are framed within this deficit discourse, which oversimplifies their challenges, and we say that they have only these language challenges, without not maybe looking into those like literacy practices they have at school and at university. What are the differences there? And also then it's genre exposure. So again, what genres they were exposed to before, for example, at school again, and at university. So even in this study, when we had interviews with participants, students would say that at university, for the first time, I had to, for example, read this kind of research article or argumentative, for example, article, academic article. So new genres appear in university setting that again might cause some challenges. So here we can see that it is beyond language, it's more than language, and there are other factors that contribute to challenges. So that's why our study aims to investigate the discourse, cultural understanding and literacies encapsulated in academic texts. And here you can see the research questions. So how is Western culture represented in academic texts and materials used in EMI university setting? And because English languages cannot be separated from the culture. Then question number 2, what linguistic and cultural capital would students need to successfully navigate the reading requirements of their courses? And lastly, how students themselves perceive and navigate those challenges or the influence of those cultural representations on their sense of belonging, identity formation, and integration into a university environment. So this is the theoretical framework of our study. So first of all, we relied on Bourdieu's sociocultural theory. Why? Because this framework can help us explore how power operates in academic spaces and how students navigate these different social spaces. So here you can see different spaces of school and university. For example, if they transition from, let's say, mainstream school to EMI university, how they navigate those challenges, what are the differences between these social spaces and their positioning in the fields. Then it can help us unpack cultural capital of students. What's their background, what's their school background, family background, socioeconomic conditions, and how that affects on their position in the field, on their perception of their experiences and challenges. And then lastly, how these power dynamics and how can it influence and perpetuate maybe certain existing inequalities, or reproduction of social classes. So for example, if a student already comes from a strong socioeconomic background, from a strong school, then they will feel almost like fish in water at university setting. They will have maybe fewer challenges and navigate those challenges that they have more easily, and maybe not even perceive some of their problems as challenges. So, and then why systemic functional linguistics? Because it can help us unveil these processes that Bourdieu describes and how they are encoded in language. It can help us analyze how this cultural linguistic capital is represented and evaluated in text, and how it can also help us reveal epistemological hierarchies in text, which epistemologies are valued. Is there any space for alternative views? And here, especially, we use appraisal framework to analyze attitude, engagement, and graduation in text. For example, attitude, what is appreciated when we look at academic texts. Engagement, for example, are alternative voices valued? So this is the theoretical framework of the study. And as methodology, we use document analysis to look at the relationship between purpose of text and cultural and situational contexts. And semi-structured interviews we used in order to explore students' own perceptions of this topic. So how it affects their reading experiences, how it affects their sense of belonging, identity formation. And about the data analysis process, so here we try to illustrate how data analysis process went for us. So first it started, we began the analysis by just initially reading the text and interview transcripts, familiarizing ourselves with the data, noting down any initial observations we had, any patterns that kind of jumped at us, sharing these ideas inside our team. Then inductive analysis, we try to look at like what themes, what topics emerge from the data related to language patterns, to cultural factors. Then deductive analysis, here we applied SFL categories and Bourdieu's concepts to refine our coding framework. Then thematic analysis, where we analyzed inductive and deductive codes. And currently we're trying to synthesize all these themes to try and uncover kind of broader patterns and see what the data really telling us. So, and let me present some findings. So first about Western culture in academic texts. So cultural references and understanding. So here you can see some quotes from the interviews. So the first one, student says, they would write something like beta, alpha, something about averages, and I didn't understand what that meant in this context. None of the research I personally read in the foundation course ever explained what that was. It seems they assume the reader already understands, and I was only 17 at the time. So here you can see, at the beginning, I talk about that in the head knowledge, like knowledge of the field, knowledge of the culture. So here, for example, it seems the students is trying to refer to that knowledge of the field. So they didn't know maybe those terms. And the perception of that on their kind of sense of identity, that they felt they should have known that and they didn't know. And in the interviews, I think we heard that a lot when students kind of try to take the blame. They would say like, I should have known that, or like I could feel that like this was something I was supposed to know, but then because I didn't know, I felt like maybe that was my fault because maybe I didn't study enough before, or maybe because like teachers at school didn't give me that knowledge. The next quote says, I didn't understand what it meant, but in the story we understood that we had to laugh. It was some kind of joke in the context apparently, but no one in the class understood it. So I think maybe we just don't know what it means. So again, referring to some of the texts they read as part of their course. And lastly, although you understand that it's about a different new idea of perspective, the author approaches the main idea from a distant angle, thus it requires more intensive reading. So even the way the ideas are communicated, might be challenging, right? And as an instructor, I think what I've noticed that because students think they're supposed to know something, sometimes they're reluctant to ask questions, or sometimes they're reluctant to admit that they don't know something or they don't understand something because they feel that they should know that. And this is from the table from the analysis of text using SFL. So here you can see the SFL categories like appreciation, for example, judgment, affect. So, for example, we can look at appreciation here. So you can see example of negative appreciation from the syllabus. So 0 for the assignment, severe penalty. So these are the phrases taken from the syllabus. And then the assumption is that it assumes harsh penalties that supposed to foster motivation and accountability among students, right? And then implications for Kazakh culture. So it reflects in a way authoritarian legacies that we have, but may conflict with the growing emphasis on equity and that we have now. And for example, if we look at NIS students, yeah, they may see this as excessive given their exposure to more constructive feedback approach. But maybe for students from mainstream schools, this may reinforce familiar punitive measures. And that can potentially demotivate learners. Yeah. So next one about students, more about students' perspectives, about cultural and linguistic capital that they need to navigate the text and what challenges they experience. So here, for example, the first quote says there could also be certain phrases or idiomatic expressions or peculiarities of the English language that cannot be easily translated into other languages. And those moments are unclear and might complicate the text. Sometimes you just want to cool down because your head starts hurting from all the new information in the new language. Even if it's familiar information, it's still hard to understand and you're left with questions. I remember the same theme emerged in my master's research findings as well, when students said that even the math topics that they previously studied at school and mastered, they couldn't understand when they were presented to them in this new environment in English because they couldn't understand the terms, or even they said the way of approaching this the solutions was different, and that's why they struggled a lot with their studies. Next one, I just highlighted some words that I didn't understand, and what I noticed is that, for example, what I highlighted is that it's some kind of main words that open the idea of the text. For example, law, curriculum, I understand what law means, but curriculum, I don't know what it means. So it's interesting that even one word, because it's one of the main, for example, concepts of that text, it can significantly affect their comprehension. This is probably a problem for those who haven't read much scientific text in English. I think elite schools probably make students read more scientific text in English, but for us it was all in Russian. I would have understood everything perfectly in Russian, but in English there were issues. So here they kind of compare students from maybe more kind of like they say elite schools, where they had maybe more classes in English, and students from mainstream schools, that there are certain differences in their experiences. And that's also kind of their perception of those differences. So next, perceptions of culture in texts. So one student says, I think it's more related to cultural background. Our mentalities are very different and we might not understand some phrases. Or I think if I read some text that's related to other cultures like Indian and American cultures, I probably wouldn't understand even if I could translate it. I think it's the topics that I'm not very familiar with that are harder. The ones I hear about more often in the news or on social media are easier to read. As I live in Kazakhstan, I'm not much aware of it. Probably for the professionals of that field, it doesn't influence their comprehension. And I am not well aware even of Kazakhstani lawyers. So they have this text about law education in the US. So this is what they're referring to, that they had hard time understanding the text because, first of all, it was the field. They had little knowledge about law education, and also the context that is not familiar, the American context and American education. And the last quote, it's kind of shows the opposite. The student says, but since I have background in Kazakh culture, it was relatively easy for me to understand. I think that was the only text that touched on culture. So because they had this background, that was relatively easy to understand because they had this knowledge to rely on. So what are the possible implications? So of course, I guess when we synthesize our findings more, we'll have more implications and recommendations for especially students in transition and for teaching instructors. But here are some general implications that we can draw at this stage. So about intersection of language and culture in academic tests. So we should try to go beyond the language problem in Kazakhstan towards a deeper examination of the difficulties faced by students, especially in non-Western contexts like ours, especially during this critical period of transition from school to university, because it's not only about adjusting to studying new language, but also about adopting to new cultural models embedded within academic discourse. And for Kazakhstani students, it might mean adapting to Western cultural models dominant in academic texts, which requires more than just high language proficiency. It demands understanding of those cultural underpinnings of the discourse. And by highlighting the intersection of language and culture, students might navigate not only these linguistic structures, but also look at kind of analyze and critically evaluate power dynamics and values embodied in them, which can help shape their ability to engage more critically with the materials. So, and now we're working on this book chapter, which called The Obvious But Overlooked, which is part of the book called Supporting Cultural and Linguistic Differences Through Literacy Education. So we're currently working on it, and yeah. So, and I wanted to finish with this quote from Pierre Bourdieu from his 1989 article, which says that symbolic power is a power of constructing reality, and in particular, constructing the social world with its divisions, hierarchies, and its legitimations. It's a power that can make people see and believe certain visions of the world and their place in it, often without them being fully aware of its influence. So just like in our study where students are part of this world, but sometimes they are not aware of that, and they might think that it's only about language. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Then we have quite a lot of time, so we can start with a buzz, yeah? 5-minute buzz. If you would like to pair up with the person next to you, maybe Amira, you can join them, or then Olivia. So just to discuss, how does it relate to your own experience, the ideas Assel shared, and maybe, if there is a particular question you would like to ask Assel. I'm thinking, Assel, I was a Pakistani academic
teaching at the moment.
Who works in the kitchen, and they are currently working on, they sent me a call because I do like textbook analysis, and this one is particularly on the colonization and text analysis. So I will share that call with you. You might be interested in the contributing to it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Things that are usually associated with something in Kazakhstan, and then trying to move towards how this could be a vision of
So much.
and stuff, and how there could be different visions of within a society.
Data can lend itself very easily just the textbook part. They are only doing text analysis.
Say by the younger, 80 by the older.
Yeah.
So there's a way of like bringing together. But I mean, this.
I think it was a bit difficult, like also because I researched for this presentation, because it's like I'm like trying to and making sense of
Yeah.
it. So,
When you got made a photo,
Is
guys,
very
you're somewhere and when you get some
absorbed,
telling me
you know, you make sense of it.
What about
it's the apple YouTube.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Dangerous single story.
Yeah, yeah.
let's say she's created a number of single channels, because she's always open for different questions. Because sometimes I might like just email her saying like I don't understand what this means. Oh no, not last time. Yeah, she was very busy because she told me like one day she said like I have everything. You didn't see her as well?
No, I
Have to
didn't.
learn to target it.
But I saw
So that's yeah.
kids in his
Western, but it's also not all Western.
People say it's very
We're
The West, so we are struggle with the idea of
yeah. So it's as much of a class thing as it is.
But in the show when she
Okay,
went
based
to
on
the planet, it was very
Yeah.
Like it's, yeah. Western.
It's also reinforced by people that are non-Western as well. It's also reinforced.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
It's been using, you know,
Yeah.
the idioms that are used. You're being acting is very active.
And it's.
Yeah, we try to use this lexical categories and
What
it was very
publishers
interesting.
what's accepted. There's a neoliberal.
Of course.
Of course, like there's something that. Yeah.
Quite a while.
And,
But time, like at the same time, it feels like it was a long time ago, but also it feels like time flies very fast. Now it's almost
Okay, but this is the end of the project almost, the real, I mean, really now you will start engaging with.
I really want to go back to that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, and
Have a look at the questions.
It's to delve deeper into the cultural.
Yeah.
What is it that the tech force?
And then how can you change it or reinterpret it or?
Yeah.
You know, actually. One of the things I did get from some of my students, but again, it's like, you know, the people that just, you know, keep on reproducing the same structure. When I was asking my students, you know, what would you like to change? What would you throw out? They want to get rid of things that are more associated with like things. You would want to look at things that are Western, you want to look at things that are more, you know, they're this or this. Strangely, you know, because all of the, you know, the decolonial kind of literature at the moment is really focused on how can we bring local voices
If there are, let us know.
and into the process of actually. And then when you ask, you know, students, you know, that all of my classes this semester were more or less of our local thing.
Yeah, exactly,
You know,
yeah.
you're going international, you know,
Yeah.
American, or they were like, well, we're reading about like
The colonized movement hasn't quite caught on locally in the,
Yeah.
it's still a Western-led movement.
Which is again, in itself is colonial. It's the coloniality of decolonialism.
Exactly, yeah.
It's also interesting.
Oh,
I had a brief discussion with my
guys like us
one
going
of our
around
teachers.
Yeah.
Last year,
No, we didn't
and
colonize it, we decolonized.
And I remember we discussed one of the articles we gave students, and I said, I think they're struggling because this is basically US education.
So trying to encourage.
She was very surprised, genuinely, because she said, no, like if they learn it's time to really.
Also, some people don't want to, like, because I remember having a rap as well. Some people don't want to really decolonialize, especially some of the local references. And they were like, no, we spent so much time like doing all of this stuff and learning all of this stuff to create an academic, because in Iraq they're part of their academic system is based on the British system.
Okay, thank you.
Got this lot to do with this stuff and then sort of change it to.
We can now make the floor open for questions and answers, also sharing your thoughts and observations. The online participants are also welcomed to share their thoughts and ask any questions they might have. Who would like to go first?
I have a request.
Yeah.
If
Yes.
we could go back to, if we're just going to leave this on the screen,
Yeah.
can we go back to the little grid that was on there? Just to have a, yeah, that one.
The text was.
Because I'm sure I have a
Yeah.
question somewhere here,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I wonder.
Yeah. I mean, this head, in the head knowledge, yeah, we constantly as speakers and as writers assume that our listeners or our readers know what we are talking about. I'm just reminded of a recent writing retreat where a group of us from different universities gathered to write a research grant proposal. And my colleague Ellen Thibault from the School of Social Sciences and Humanities, or SSH, she's a political scientist, and the rest of us are all from education. Yeah, and we constantly use different acronyms. But Ellen is not afraid. Yeah, like these students can feel ashamed of admitting their ignorance. So something very, for us, like TVET, she would stop us. Can you please explain what does TVET mean? Or ESRs, yeah, early career researchers. She would stop us. Can you please explain to us? Yeah, so unless you make those links apparent, it's very hard even for a very competent speaker of a particular language to understand what is being discussed or what is being written as well. And sometimes this can also create, I think, problems. Your pre-existing knowledge or schema can also create problems for you. For example, I remember I had a colleague who taught education studies in German universities. And he would say he had such a hard time teaching the concept of test reliability to German students because Germans in general have such huge trust in teachers. And they wouldn't get this idea, like if a test has been developed by a teacher, who cares to establish its trustworthiness, because it has to be trustworthy because a teacher has prepared it. Yeah, so its absence can be a problem, but sometimes the presence can also be a problem. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment.
Yes.
I'm a research assistant of the project of coming university teachers seminar, practical oriented seminar for the groups, English medium instructed groups. So that is not about only the language itself, but it's also culture goes along with this language. And yes, it's not about the deficit of the language, but some cultural terms which should be explained to students, especially transitioning students. Yes, so one of the citations come like curriculum. Yes, curriculum is not clear from the school context. It might be clear only in a university context. Yeah, so that is why just our message is to deliver to other university instructors, professors that who teach in English, that it is not only to focus on language, but also culture, the knowledge-based in-head knowledge also is very important. Contextual knowledge is also very important while teaching the course. So we are planning to make it out of this research some more practical seminars. So, so this is like one of the outcome of this research. I think is a wonderful and a very helpful project.
Thank you very much, Jansa, for sharing those observations. Yes, Tom?
Yeah, we're something that there's quite a lot of discussion about the West and the Kazakh, but there's also, I guess, and you mentioned it to some degree, goes beyond that, because there's the colonial legacy and the Western influence on epistemic and academic knowledge production, and but there's also, but that's taken up by kind of the elite academics around the world, because English is so dominant as a academic language, and it's fed by kind of the publication requirements of journals and the culture of that, which is also kind of so there's a neoliberal element to it, because it's a huge kind of there's a huge publication market. So that's just kind of a comment and an observation. So as much as it is kind of an East-West thing, it's become globalized, and there seems to be a cosmopolitan cultural capital that even people in the West who don't fit into that are excluded from. So they're also part of that outgroup, which is quite interesting. So there's quite a complex dynamic.
Absolutely, and culture can be consumed in very different ways as well. It is not limited to geography and space. I mean, I'm just thinking, I grew up in Pakistan, a very conservative society, but I went to a missionary school. So all the texts that I read, they were from the West, at age, I was in my early 30s when I first actually visited the United Kingdom. But nothing shocked me, although the texts were written far ago, so they were not about contemporary British society when I visited it, but nothing shocked me compared to another colleague who also went with me to visit Britain, but from a very different educational background. Like, she was really shocked. Everything she saw shook her. For me, although this was my first ever visit to British society, because I had consumed English literature from my, very childhood, nothing was surprising to me. So you can still consume culture via books, via television shows, via films, by living in a very different space as well. You're talking about, how elite. So that's, that's a very good observation.
I think Professor Michelle wants to say something, but I'm not sure. Professor Michelle, can you say
Hi, Michelle.
Yes. Hey, Noreen. Hello, everyone. How's it going? I missed most of the presentation because I'm sick. But I'm sure that Assel did a good job. I think I really just wanted to, I'm not sure if Assel actually gave some background as to how her project started. And it was basically her starting to work at CPS and then actually engaging with students and going to one of the Western colleagues and saying, I think this is the issue for our students. It is this. And the person saying, no, but it's obvious. It's there. And she was like, it's maybe obvious for the Westerner, but it's not as obvious for me, even as a CPS teaching fellow. And I think that's where the whole interest in this started. And then on the other hand, I think it's also about the text that we select. So I'm not sure if they actually presented the analysis of the text that was selected for this particular course. And so the one was heavily American-based. The students struggled with the metaphorical language in there. But the most important thing is that this text was written, the field was a highly specialized field. So if you do the analysis, it was for professors at the top level of their careers that would understand this language. And so everything within the text would be extremely challenging for these students. And so I think what we're trying to argue for is to say probably most of our professors are aware of the cultural aspects, but you're not looking at the text itself to see that the audience for this text is too specialized, the register is too specialized for these students coming from high schools. and therefore they would be struggling. So we had this one text, highly specialized, written for a specific field, and then we had a text from the Kazakh context, the two journals. And the amazing thing is how the students were able to engage much better with the second text, because they had some of that background knowledge. And so I think part of the project is for us to have conversations about, think carefully about the text that we choose. So even if we are aware of culture, think of who's this written for. Is this language accessible for first-year students or foundation year students? And how would they be accessible? And if not, how can I then scaffold an understanding of these texts for these students? So that's just what I wanted to kind of add to the discussion. And it's always lovely to see all of you and to engage with my NU family on the other side. So thank you so much, Noreen, and thank you for CARCEIT for making this project possible.
It's so good to see you, Michelle. I was talking to Assel. I recently received a call from scholars who are literary critics, and they are writing an edited collection looking at decolonial approaches to analyzing texts. I will forward that call both to you and Assel and see if this is something that you might be interested in using your research and writing of the chapter.
Thank you so much, Noreen.
Yes.
There was something I was noticing here, which it's kind of like a comment, but I suppose there might be a question from it. I'll think of it as I speak. Was the judgment one where it says demonstrated high personal integrity? So the second one, it says assumes that Western Western individuality over non-Western collectivism and communality. Yeah, and that reminds me of not just academic text. We're talking specifically about academic texture, but the wider academia in general. Something I noticed when I was previously working in Iraq was the idea of cheating within academia, and the idea of using somebody else's work or quoting other people or using even things like AI. Students really found it difficult because, especially with AI, because they'd seen it as they were generating it. So they're like, well, it's my work. It is my individual work now. But also outside of that, when they would get together and they would copy things from each other and present, and they would struggle sometimes to understand why that was an academic integrity issue, because in society in Iraq, it's quite communal based. It's very collective. As well, and so I think it's not just within the language and academic text. I think within the larger thing as well. And it's very difficult then to kind of, I suppose, administer tests or administer especially when people are writing long academic text for an essay or something for you as well. So I suppose what would my question be from that? How would you combat something like that with the research that you've done so far? Or how would you advise to combat something like that?
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Michelle, would you like to,
Okay, so thank you for that question. I think what's really important there, yes, it's not only in academic text, and this is exactly our point, that even though plagiarism and cheating is something that we coin, it is academia, it's something specific to academia, but what we should obviously be looking at is having conversations with our students about the literacy practices within their cultures. So if it's collectivism, if it's about copying and pasting, how do we unpack that for them? So I find that looking at, if we see academic text stories, kind of looking at stories and issues of voice in stories, where it's, we have names, we use pronouns, and so how's this different in dialogues, and how's it signaled in academic text, for example? And so how do we signal our voice in academic text? It's not plagiarism, it's about signaling that acknowledging that these people have been publishing these works. So it's about having a deeper conversation. There's a scholarship going on well, there's a conversation going on in all texts. So what does the conversation look like in academic text, right? It's not just I must cite. Why am I citing? Why? What's the reason for these citations? It is about a scholarly conversation and students understanding that they are entering a specific conversation with specific ways of doing. So I think for me, it's important to find their ways of doing and what she speaks about the primary discourses versus the secondary discourses, and trying to find bridges that we can build so that it's not a technical thing. It's actually, I'm taking on a new identity, and within this identity, there are new ways of doing. And so what are the cultural bridges between academia and storytelling and the oral traditions in the Kazakh culture, for example? And I think with plagiarism and citations, it's all about voices. Whose voice and who's speaking and why are they speaking? Where are you in this text and where's the writer in this text? And I think sometimes we miss on making those things explicit as well for our students. And I think that might be a good in terms of a culturally, linguistically relevant pedagogy where they bring in their resources from home and they basically compare those resources with what's happening in other contexts, in other cultures, and their ways of doing. I think we might need more conversations around that, as opposed to saying plagiarism is bad, you cannot cheat, cheating is bad. Yes, it is bad, but what is cheating and what is storytelling and how can we connect the two? I think it's all about voice, the issue of indicating who's speaking and who's having a conversation and why can this person have a conversation. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, Tom.
Something that occurred, I mean, it's connected with language in Western cultures, kind of the idea of a monolingual learning space.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that could be challenged, and because learners in CPS, for example, are multilingual. They typically speak Kazakh,
Yeah.
Russian, and English, and bringing in those linguistic resources, kind of, and having discussions beyond just English, I think would open up and empower students who might struggle culturally with the texts, both linguistically and culturally in other ways, like epistemically. So I wonder if that's something that, if that's a discussion that enters their research, if that's something that's addressed.
Yeah, relying on languages in their repertoire.
Yeah, kind of like, so kind of shifting away from a monolingual model in CPS, for example, to a translingual model, and allow, kind of enabling and empowering students to use all of their linguistic and communication resources and not focus so much on, okay, we're going to go and improve your English, but a more
Yeah.
holistic approach.
Right. Yeah, more about developing their thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Question I would have to that then is, if you have a teacher that's, for example, an international teacher doesn't speak Russian or Kazakh, like you have in the Writing Centre and in the Centre for Primary Studies as well, then how would you manage that when they're writing a paper, for example?
Well, I mean, the students can speak to each other. There can be multiple ways of channels of communication. So it doesn't have to be teacher-centered. It could be the learners discussing in languages that they want to discuss in, and
Okay.
So
I in my mind, because I'm always thinking about people using things like, so in my mind, I was thinking of how if you have a lecturer that let's say doesn't speak Russian, and this is just a hypothesis now, I'd say, and then you have a student that obviously does, and they're using a lot of Russian-based Russian text within their text. How then would you?
Well, I don't
specifically for something like for CPS or literary composition or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was thinking not so much for submissions, but for negotiating texts and the learning space itself. So I imagine there's not much flexibility in submitting work in English, but the process of so could incorporate other languages into it. Students can negotiate as they're going along. Because typically what happens is, universities or language centers tend to not authorize students to use other languages, meant to be an English only space. and that actually could disadvantage students who could benefit from negotiating the language in their own communicative capacities rather than just trying to work it out only in English with all the challenges that brings. So, and they can do it together as a group. If the teacher doesn't speak their languages, that's fine. They could, there could be that decenters the teacher from the process, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And
there's an element of trust in there with the students though as well. If the teacher doesn't speak like Russian, and then we need to get through this text, but how can the teacher make sure that all avenues work? How can the teacher like still facilitate in a way if they're not part of the language?
Well, they can be. I mean, they can give space for a certain amount of time for students to discuss as you give pair work, and then you come back together, and then the teacher use English. And
I mean, we have some students sitting here, and although we don't teach language in our school, what you are kind of suggesting, Tom, it happens in our classrooms. We do use key readings, although not with the objective of teaching language, but teaching concepts, teaching ideas. Students read those texts in English, but in group work, in discussion, they often switch to Russian within the group. And although I can't be of help to them while they are discussing, but it's okay, because afterwards they do share their ideas regarding the concepts that they were discussing, and it's wonderful for students to be given that freedom of sharing ideas, because my question is related to kind of what you earlier mentioned, Tom. Assel, you in the beginning you talked about linguistic capital and cultural capital, and I'm more interested in understanding, how these students mobilize different cultural capitals to make sense of the text, and kind of linking back to Tom earlier's point about not using non-Western context as homogeneous, or even using Western context as homogeneous. The texts that comes from the West, they don't represent the heterogeneity of Western cultures. Specific Western cultures get represented through text, which again, even if you are from a Western culture, may not identify very well. And there has been like quite a growing body of literature on the experiences of marginalized Western students in Western universities, and how they find it very hard because they don't have the cultural capital. So I'm just interested in understanding, you mentioned NIS students versus those from mainstream schools, and can you please a bit unpack more about how those students from NIS were still in a position to use cultural capital to make sense and navigate the texts they were using? Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess I recall two kind of vivid examples. I think from my last year, I had two students. One female student, she was from a state school, and she was more from a small town, I think. And then I had one male student. He was from, I think it was NIS school or maybe Beale school. And he would often talk about like how they had English literature at home and how he travels a lot with his parents. And that was interesting when we were preparing for like their reading response assignments, how they their approach and their experience of reading the text was completely different. Because he would say, oh, for example, there was, I remember an example of Jekyll and Hyde from literature. And he was like, oh, I remember reading this when I was like, I was reading this with my mom or my dad, and we were discussing this. And he immediately understood the example and why this example was used in that text. But then the girl, she didn't know this example at all. She was not familiar with it. And in general, like reading the text was very difficult for her. And I think not only objective difficulties or challenges students face, but I think even perceptions matter, yeah? Because I remember during the whole year, she would often say like, I'm just from a state school, I'm just from a state school. Even kind of the way she perceived, maybe if she perceived it differently, she would have dealt with those challenges maybe more easily. But the way she perceived that she was from state school and other students were from maybe BL or like NIS schools, and that she couldn't really compete with them, and she felt that she had more challenges, and she would often stay to talk about her challenges, and because she needed to share, because she was struggling a lot even in terms of like, I think, kind of mental preparedness to handle those challenges. So I guess that was interesting. And that male student, he felt like he was almost kind of sailing through studies. So I think even the perception is interesting, how kind of the capital affected not only their actual challenges, but also the way they perceived and approached these challenges, I think. Yeah, so that was interesting. And in this study also, we had one participant who was talking a lot. I think in the slides, there was this comment how he said in elite schools, they probably read a lot texts in English, scientific texts in English. And he said like, I'm from Russian medium school, and here it is, This is probably a problem for those who haven't read much scientific text in English. So this participant talked a lot about their frustration, that they felt almost kind of excluded, because they said like, oh, they had those like students from kind of English medium schools, and they would like discuss those concepts that we had in class that they already studied them before or already discussed them before, but I was not familiar, and I didn't feel even like joining those discussions. So yeah, I guess that's interesting. Yeah, the way it
Thank you. I'm further interested in this self-perception. Perceptions are, of course, they develop through interaction. And I wonder the extent to which they took that identity position up because they were positioned like that by their peers. In that context, in Pakistan, for example, we have a very derogative term for someone from a village called Pendu, and often those who come from rural areas and universities, people just call them by that derogative term, to shame them in a way about not knowing all these kinds of cultural knowledges, not having those important cultural codes. So I wonder to what extent they are not self-perceptions, but they are taking up that position up because they were positioned like that by significant others.
I can add also, because I was been interviewing. So the further comment of this exact young man about his background, he told about that when he came here, everyone knows each other. So this was a very interesting, because they all read all their background from NIS, or they somehow familiar, they have common, some shared background, they can share something, maybe experience with some familiar. So everyone knows everyone. So while he is excluded and he doesn't know anyone. So this way he felt himself alienated. So that was like somehow, I mean, I don't know, probably there are kind of particular culture in a relationship among them. They know each other and they have something, of course, it's a shared experience, and they are more shared interest maybe from the NIS school and more like elite school. That is why this young man also mentioned that he visited psychologist. So like he felt actually a bit frustrated.
There was even a phrase, I thought to myself, what am I even doing here? I don't belong here.
I mean, your study has enormous implications for inclusion, beyond textbooks. As Michelle mentioned, how can teachers use these textbooks in a way that, students are properly scaffolded, but also these divisions among students as well, that all students are not the same, They're coming with very different cultural capital, and some might not be lacking the linguistic capital, but some might usually be disadvantaged because of the lack of cultural capital.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to share my own experience as an English teacher. So before I did my PhD here, 15 years I was teaching English. So I didn't know about the flipped classroom. I didn't know learner-centered approach. I'm from Soviet background, etc. But I recently came to this that reading tasks I always give as homework because I knew that there's a lot of things that they do not understand. So like from different backgrounds. They come home, they read the same text. Maybe I don't know this. Maybe I don't know this cultural aspect. But they try to find themselves, this information. So, so when they came, one of the students who is from more privileged context knows maybe better, and towards that person it took maybe 1 hour to read. But the next person, maybe from a village, but that person maybe it took him to read it like 2 or 3 hours because she or he had to find the background information. So for me, I was always like, I never spent time for reading during the classroom. English classroom, they came already, they read already, they knew already. So they could come and say, oh, I didn't know this, but I found myself, the internet was there. So one of the ways how I came intuitively to this, I didn't know about inclusion or anything like that, but I wanted everybody to be engaged, to be involved in the classroom. So this is one of the things that I try to find some creative ways, like how they can read this text in a more creative way. So I think it's about giving them like their own, to work in their own pace in terms of maybe somebody must spend more time maybe to read this or that text. The only thing is like I just thought about myself reading IELTS texts, for example. And I thought, why am I supposed to know this or that? And you never know what kind of text will come there, right? You don't have time. So it's not because my English language, it's just I don't understand. Like, for example, there was a text, it's about how to open the mechanism of opening the locker. I don't understand it in Kazakh or in Russian. So that is another thing. About tests, I think it is a little bit like inequality is there. But about the classroom, I think they can always be found, like, choosing the text or like some texts in a very technical text. I don't think that there is culture there. I mean, you need to understand, for example, I don't know, science, let's say. So this is how I found the way how to solve this in the classroom. So I don't know if I'm understood or not. Then what I want to this is practically I was just thinking.
Okay, you want to say?
Just a brief comment. I guess students themselves sometimes don't realize what's the challenge. When they experience challenges, they don't often realize the root of their challenge, because I think our students also, because they do reading on their own and they can like book office hours, for example, or like ask questions in class if they have questions. And sometimes they say like, I think my English is not enough for this text, but they don't think about like kind of looking at those, maybe just picking out this maybe cultural moments or contextual moments that are not clear, and maybe looking into them first, to scaffold their own understanding. So sometimes, like as teacher, you need to try and support.
The topic was charity, for example, and then there is a sentence: I ran for charity, and we don't understand what it means to be part of marathon, running for charity. What does that mean? Or I went to Antarctica to make this. To raise money, and children like don't understand. So I always ask them like to find more information themselves. Like what does it mean? And now it is already popular in Kazakhstan. Now we know already. At that time we
running for charity.
Noreen,
Yes.
can I just maybe just add a final point? I think what we also need to remember is when we speak about culture, we're not only speaking about Western culture in text, right? We're also speaking about, if we think of the the field of the text. So that means the aboutness of the text. What is the text about? So the culture could be the medical field, which means if we give students more scientific text, that's more of a scientific cultural ways of doing things versus narrative text. So we find that if we give students narratives and recounts and, the stories, it's easier for them to understand because that's close to our cultures. But if it's cultural text associated with science, it means there will be specific cultural ways, like prefixes and suffixes have meaning, right? So if you think of bio, I'm not in science, I'm trying to think quickly, but maybe Assel can take this point forward. So when we say culture, we're not just meaning let's chuck all the Western things away. We are saying that we need to understand the genre. What is the purpose of this text? What is the social context that this text is occurring in? And who is the audience? If the audience are medical doctors, and I give students in year 1 in the social sciences a text like that, it's going to have cultural implications for those ones that are not familiar with the medical field. So I think what we're trying to argue through Assel's work is that we need to understand not just East and West, Kazakh and English culture, but we need to understand the purposes in text, and therefore most of the times we find that teachers need to understand the genres. They need to have a genre-specific approach to text to unpack those cultural issues. And if I think of the South African context, for example, I remember when I was teaching there, I had a first-year student who was just not doing well, but he made it to university. So if you made it to university, you should do well. And then I chatted with him. It's like, I don't know what it is. I keep on getting headaches. I get headaches. And I said, okay, tell me a little bit about your family. And he said, oh, I am an indigenous student. I lived in this community and I'm the first boy in my community who's studying. Right. And so for him, it was the cultural, all the expectations of the culture and the community, and coming into university, not having enough English, and then having to realize that I thought I was good and the whole community is looking at me. And so these academic stresses. So I think we're trying to say, if we understand that these students are coming with emotional well-being issues, what can we do? So I had to go to colleagues and say, listen, yeah, this is an issue. This is a first generation student, right? So we have first generation student versus second generation and your rich students. So it means we need to become more aware of the issues that students can face as a result of those cultural capitals that they have or that they don't have. And again, in text, it's not just Western culture, it's not English culture, it's really about the genre, the purpose of these texts, and the field-specific things within the text that needs to be unpacked for students, in this case, from state or rural schools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Let's give a big hand to Assel, Advantai, and Michelle. Katia, we have the last one next week, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, so that will be our last seminar. Please do join us next Thursday. Thank you very much.
They're all good.